Sue's house was quiet that morning, except for the occasional sound of birds outside and the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. Inside, Tim sat at the kitchen table, his spoon stirring aimlessly in his bowl of cereal. His space-themed diaper peeked out from under his t-shirt, but he didn't notice. He hadn't noticed in a while. Across from him, his mom sat with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, watching him. They had a doctor's appointment today. She hadn't told him yet, and she wasn't sure when the right time would be. Tim was fragile these days. He got overwhelmed so easily. Telling him too early could send him spiraling into one of his quiet, withdrawn moods. But telling him too late might catch him off guard. "Timmy," she said finally, her voice soft and careful. "We're going to the doctor today. Just a quick checkup." Tim's spoon stilled in his cereal, his eyes lifting slowly to meet hers. His lips pressed together tightly, and he looked down again, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of the table. "Do I have to?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Yes, sweetie. Just for a little bit. I'll be with you the whole time. And afterward..." She paused, thinking quickly. "We can go get some ice cream. How about that?" Tim didn't respond at first, but his grip on the spoon relaxed. Ice cream was a decent bribe. He didn't seem happy about the idea of the doctor's visit, but he didn't argue either, which was more than she had hoped for. She stood up to clear the table, relieved that at least this part of the morning had gone smoothly. The drive to the doctor's office was silent, except for the hum of the car and the occasional sound of Tim shifting in his seat. He wasn't a fan of car rides, especially when they were heading to appointments. He sat stiffly, his hands resting on his knees, occasionally glancing out at the window but saying nothing. His mom reached over to squeeze his hand as they pulled into the parking lot. "We'll be done before you know it," she said, though she wasn't sure if she was comforting him or herself. Inside the doctor's office, Tim clung tightly to her hand. His body language was tense, his eyes darting nervously around the waiting room. They were called back after what felt like an eternity, and the nurse led them to an exam room where Dr. Reynolds waited. She smiled warmly at Tim, crouching down to his level. She was a tall woman, maybe mid-30s, with bright eyes and an easy smile. But Tim barely noticed. He stood there in just his diaper, his face red with embarrassment. He didn't say a word, though his discomfort was obvious. "Hi, Tim," Dr. Reynolds said gently. "I'm Dr. Reynolds. I'm just going to do a quick checkup, okay? It won't take long." Im stared at the floor, his feet shuffling slightly. He didn't meet her gaze. His mom stood nearby, watching him closely. She had opted to skip the medical gown, knowing it would only make things harder. Tim didn't like the way the gowns felt, and getting him to wear one would have been an unnecessary battle. His mind was too much like a child's to care about things like modesty, and she was beyond worrying about what others thought. The exam began, and Tim stood stiffly while Dr. Reynolds checked his reflexes, gently pressing on his stomach and listening to his heartbeat. He flinched at every touch, though he didn't speak. His face was flushed, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. "He's healthy," Dr. Reynolds said, glancing at her chart. "Physically, there's nothing wrong. But mentally..." She paused, searching for the right words. "His development is much closer to a 4-year-old's than an adult's." His mom nodded, her expression heavy. "I know. It's just hard sometimes. He's got the body of an adult, but his mind, it's still so young." Dr. Reynolds gave her a sympathetic look. "You're doing the right thing, getting him regular checkups. It's important to stay on top of his health, even if his mental state doesn't quite line up with his physical age." The conversation drifted into familiar territory. Discussions of care, suggestions for new therapies, ways to help Tim adjust. But Tim seemed oblivious. He stood there, his eyes drifting to the posters on the wall, his fingers twitching nervously. When the exam was finished, the nurse returned with a fresh diaper. "All right, let's get you changed before you leave," she said brightly, her voice too cheerful for the situation. Tim's face turned crimson, and he shifted from foot to foot, his shoulders hunched. He hated this part, but as usual, he didn't resist. The nurse worked quickly, and within a few moments they were back in the car, heading toward the ice cream shop. "You did great, Timmy," his mom said, trying to ease the tension. "Now, how about that ice cream?" Tim didn't answer, but he seemed less tense now, his gaze fixed out the window. When they arrived at the shop, he pressed his face against the glass, staring at the tubs of ice cream inside. "Pistache?" she asked, surprised. "That's a very grown-up choice for you." Tim hesitated, his eyes darting between the brightly colored tubs. After a moment, he pointed to a tub labeled Superhero. It was a swirl of bright blue and yellow, with chunks of candy and marshmallow pieces scattered throughout. "No, I want that one," he whispered. "Superhero it is," she said with a small smile. They sat outside in the sun, Tim happily devouring his ice cream. The superhero flavor was messy, dripping down his chin and onto his hands. He didn't seem to notice the sticky mess, his focus entirely on the colorful swirls in his cone. His mom wiped his face with a napkin, ignoring the glances from passers-by who couldn't seem to understand why a grown man was eating ice cream like a child. Back at Sue's house, the afternoon passed quietly. Tim played with his toys on the floor while his mom prepared dinner. By the time lasagna was ready, Tim was already a mess, with toy cars scattered around him and sauce all over his face from dinner. But he seemed content, which was all she cared about. After dinner, she tucked him into bed, pulling the blanket up around his chin. He clutched his stuffed animal tightly, his eyelids heavy as he drifted off to sleep. "I love you, Timmy," she whispered, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. She stood there for a moment, watching him sleep. Then she headed to the living room where Sue was waiting. They sat together, speaking quietly about the future. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," his mom said, her voice breaking. "He needs more care than I can give." Sue nodded. "There's a place called the Ranch. It's a group home, but it's really well run. I've heard good things about it. They might be able to give him the kind of care he needs." The next morning, they visited the ranch. The building was large, with open spaces and a sense of calm that Tim seemed to appreciate. He clung to his mom's hand as they walked through the hallways, his eyes wide with curiosity. They met a young man named Malcolm, who smiled and introduced himself. Tim seemed to like him, though he stayed quiet, his usual shyness kicking in. But soon, a familiar smell filled the air. His mom sighed, her face softening with understanding. "Let's get you to the bathroom, Timmy," she said gently, guiding him away. After a quick change, they continued the tour. Tim seemed to enjoy the open space and friendly atmosphere, but his mom's heart was heavy. Could she really leave him here? Was this the right thing to do? That night she lay awake, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. The conversation with Sue and the doctor had made sense, but this was Tim. Her Tim. She wasn't sure if she could let go. The following day, they went to see Dr. Hancock, who had been Tim's doctor for years. After a long conversation, Dr. Hancock reassured her that the ranch might be the best option for Tim. Later that night, she took Tim to the movies as a special treat. She dressed him in a thicker diaper with an extra pad, knowing he would want soda during the film. He held her hand tightly as they walked into the theater, his eyes lighting up with excitement. The soda was a risk, but it was the movies, and she didn't want to deny him this small joy. After the movie, she tucked Tim into bed, sitting beside him quietly. "Timmy," she said softly, stroking his hair. "The ranch might be a good place for you, but I haven't made up my mind yet." Tim looked up at her, his wide eyes full of uncertainty. "Do I have to go?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know yet, sweetheart," she replied. "But I want what's best for you." That night, after Tim had fallen asleep, she went to her own room and cried. The decision weighed heavily on her heart. The next morning, she walked into Tim's room, her expression calm but resolute. "I've made a decision," she said softly,